to come to Canada. So I decided to start off a slide. Oh, Etienne, can you enable me to show my slideshow?
Sure, I thought
Yeah,
I did.
yeah, it's okay. I've drawn up a slideshow. I've tried to put maps to indicate where I'm talking about. Um, I've tried to make it quite visual because I'm imagining that for those of you, when you think of Western Canada, or maybe when you think of tourism to Canada generally, you tend to think about nature tourism, scenic tourism to mountainous regions, to places with big rivers, Niagara Falls, um, forests, and lightly occupied regions, with sparse settlements and so forth. And that is the bread and butter of Canada's tourist image, right? People from other parts of the world, even the neighbors in the United States, don't visit Canada for historical tourism. They come to see the environment. They come to see wilderness. This is the sort of the popular expectation that people have when they come to visit Canada, and has been for at least 130 years now. And it's an image that's been promoted by federal and provincial governments. It's an image that's been promoted by major railway companies. And so Canada's tourist image has been sort of frozen this way now for more than a century. And what I want to talk about in large part today is how, with the rise of automobile tourism, starting in the 1920s, you began to have a sort of a complement to that wilderness or natural image in the rise of a modest, or not huge scale, but modest scale historical tourism came to complement wilderness tourism. And this is part of this new landscape of competition that comes about from automobile tourism. And railway tourism, you have very firm lines. You have not a lot of competition in Canada with railway tourism, whereas with automobile tourism, you have a dramatic change. So let me see if I can share my screen here. I hope oh no, I can't do it, Etienne.
You can,
It
let's
might
try.
be in the preferences, but it's okay. I've got a few,
Mhm.
I can talk. I imagine in your course, you've talked about railway tourism quite a bit already, and I sort of thought about what are some of the key characteristics of railway tourism. I'm not sure if you've read Wolfgang Schivelbusch's book, The Railway Journey. It's a very famous cultural history called The Railway Journey. Ah, there it is.
Yeah.
It's an absolute classic of mobility history, of cultural history generally of the 19th century. And in that book, Schivelbusch is showing some of the key characteristics of railway travel. So he talks about how the tracks and the locomotive are united as a single machine. The train can't deviate from the tracks. Um, the telegraph helps the two components communicate to each other so that there's no accidents. You have a very rigid and hierarchical form of management, right? There's other people are not allowed to bring their locomotives onto someone else's tracks. It's very unified, very top down, and it's very rigid. The route is rigid, and the timetable tends to be rigid too. There's, if the train is running late, there's a problem, is what that means. So this generates a form of tourism that sort of shares many of these characteristics. Tourists tend to travel by railway along very fixed routes on fixed timetables. Only, the ultra wealthiest of the moment might have their own car that they ask to have, brought onto and added to a train, but that's sort of like the billionaire super yachts of today. That's unusual and rare. So when people look out the windows on their journeys, they tend to see the same things. They tend to stay at the same hotels in the same major cities. There's, I don't want to say uniformity, but there's a high degree of predictability to tourism by rail. Oh, the sun's coming up here. I'll tilt this my camera. It's relatively fixed, the culture of tourism that comes about from railways. And I think the same is largely true of steamships too, right? They travel a fixed schedule, fixed route. They don't deviate that much. If there's a change in timetable or in route, it suggests that something has gone wrong somewhere in the system. So it's rather inflexible. Whereas with the rise of automobile tourism, you have a radically new form of mobility in terms of the pace, in terms of the route, like the flexibility of route, being able to leave when you want, being able to travel at the speed you would like, being able to stop where you are interested to stop, to be able to venture off of side roads and go down into neighborhoods or districts that are not served by railways or that have very poor roads. If your curiosity leads you there, you have the flexibility to pursue that interest. And this generates really new landscapes of tourism and a new tourist experience. I think it becomes, I would say generally, that tourism becomes much more sort of associated with notions of freedom at this time. It's not just about cultivating a sense of national knowledge or learning about new places and people or new environments. There's an increasing experience or an ideology around tourism that associates it with freedom, with exercising sort of a sense of mastery to go when and where one wants, right? To savor the landscape on one's own terms, rather than having to follow the route and the timetable, which are quite impersonal, established by big companies. So I think this is that's a global phenomenon in terms of a change of tourism with the rise of automobiles. Automobility, I guess, is a succinct way to put it. So I think, let me see if I can do the screen share now. Let me check. I've got the thing here. Oh, I can, hooray. All right. So now can you see me while I'm talking too?
We can see your screen, yes.
Oh, good. Okay.
Yeah, we can see you.
Perfect.
We
Okay.
can see you.
While the sun is rising on me out the window here. So this new kind of competition, this new landscape of competition in response to the flexibility of automobile tourism really shapes a sense of community, sense of region. It shapes how people encounter natural environments. Now that you can now drive through wilderness, you can motor through entire regions to explore and examine their natural landscapes. And what I'm arguing here actually is that it also comes to shape how people understand history as well. In Europe, in some parts of Eastern North America, that's not unusual. I've got a new book here that's about the history of tourism in the province of Quebec. And this book talks a lot about how Quebec's tourist image was largely a historical one. Even people from France were encouraged to come to visit Quebec and drive around because they could see remnants or relics of historical French culture. It was seen as being sort of frozen in the past, having unchanged since the conquest in the late 1700s. In Western Canada, there's long been this idea that people go there, that tourism is dominated by the desire to see wilderness. And I think that to understand, how people also came to develop, how promoters and governments came to develop a historical image as well, how tourists enjoyed and why they sought out this historical image is a very...
Can I ask a question? Can I ask a question?
Yep, sure.
Yeah. if you show Alberta and the mountains behind, talking about mobility, what are you trying to show us?
Sorry. This is
Yeah,
the
this picture.
this
Yeah,
and
this
these are
picture.
places all around Canada, right? And every region, every city has some sort of signage welcoming tourists beside the highway, right? That whenever you cross from one province or from one country or even from county to county, sometimes there's a sign welcoming you. And there's something here, a logo, an icon, a slogan that invites you to stay here, to enjoy your time as a tourist here. It often is guiding you towards certain types of attractions, right? I'm not sure if you find these when you go from province to province in France, but this is absolutely commonplace everywhere in North America. Welcome to science. Stay here, enjoy your time, spend your money, tell your friends and come back. So that's that sense of community that I'm talking about. With railways, you don't have to have this sort of thing, right? There's no sense of competition. So the rise of so I'm mostly going to talk about Western Canada. And so I've flagged here the westernmost province in Canada is British Columbia. It's about 30% larger than France. It's just shy of 1 million square kilometers. It is very sparsely populated. So it was only in the late 1940s that British Columbia had more than 1 million people. It was only in the 1960s that British Columbia had more than 2 million people. So today BC has about 4.5 million residents. So that's what, twice as big as Lyon, I think, in an area 30% larger than France. So sparsely populated. And almost everyone lives in that southwesternmost corner of the province where the city of Vancouver is. That's where 2/3 of British Columbians live, in that tiny southwesternmost part of the province. It's extremely mountainous. Almost all of the province is made up of mountains and forests. There's a lot of glaciers. Only 2% of this province is suitable for agriculture, which explains why there's not, it helps explain why there's not a lot of people living there. And as you can see by the roadmap, I'll come back to this, this map on the right shows you the main highways of British Columbia, but in fact, there are not a lot of secondary highways compared to what you see here in 1920, and even today. It has a very thin road network. There are 10 times more logging roads than there are paved highways in the province. So this is an exaggerated version of North American tourism history in this sort of landscape, but it lets you see some things more clearly than in other places. So in Canada and in British Columbia, it was railway companies that set the original sort of stamp of tourist culture. They produced, they built hotels, they produced promotional campaigns, they published millions and millions of travel guides and posters and distributed them around the world. Tourism was seen as a way to sort of, early on in the 19th century, it was seen as a way to maybe draw a wealthy class of investors. It was seen as a way as perhaps even encouraging settlement. If you promote this in Britain and Scotland and Ukraine and France, and you promote tourism, there's an idea that maybe people will look at moving to Western Canada, especially. These new agricultural frontiers opened up by the completion of the Canadian Pacific Railway in 1885. This is some of the stuff I was talking about the characteristics of railway tourism. And I just put these books out there for your interest if you've not come across them yet. These are really 3 classical cultural histories of railways and railway time and space. So back to Canada, the Canadian Pacific Railway especially was the first railway to span Canada from east to west, finished in 1885, had no competitor for the next 30 years. It really set the pattern for promoting tourism in Canada. the Rocky Mountains, probably, I don't want to be guessing too much, but perhaps the image you have of tourism in Western Canada today was set up, was sort of has been shaped by this railway company since the 1880s. It makes the template for tourism promotion. Mountains, scenic vistas, hiking, glaciers, dense forests. Capital N nature is the tourist asset or the tourist commodity of Western Canada in this view. And the Canadian Pacific Railway's trains bring you there. Its hotels and bungalow camps accommodate you while you're enjoying your visit. Almost everything is filtered through this railway company, and it's taking money from the tourist trade. There's a lot of argument about whether the company profits all that much. When you're moving trains through such mountainous country, which doesn't have a lot of farms, it doesn't have much industry, a way of thinking of tourism is it's a way to defer the company's losses. You could argue that the railway has never quite made enough money in British Columbia to pay down the cost of building and maintaining the railway there. So the tourism is a sort of a way to make quick cash to defer the losses of operating in this mountainous region. Turning this sort of environmental challenge into a modest asset for the railway. And I brought this slide. This is from the Canadian National Railway, the rival, which was built in the 1910s. It was owned by the Canadian government. These pictures are all the exact same mountain, Mount Robson, the highest mountain in British Columbia. And I put this as an example to illustrate that point of how everyone sees roughly the same thing as a railway tourist. These are postcards and actually vernacular photographs made by tourists themselves, because the train always stopped at the same place near Mount Robson, and it would pause for 15 or 20 minutes so that tourists could get out and Kodak and take snapshots to mail a postcard home to their family. People were seeing the same thing. In fact, you can almost do this as by time of day. I've got hundreds of this image. And they're almost always from the same time. You don't see them at the morning, you don't see them at dusk. The train happened to stop there midday in both directions. So the photographs are actually really uniform in terms of the weather and the lighting conditions as well. I've put up a few, I'll be happy to share this. Oh yes, Amy.
I got one question. Talking about railways, did you try to make a connection between railways in Europe, in United States, and Africa? Because in South Africa, it's very important, because they was doing iron and gold.
Yep.
You know what I'm talking? Etienne, tu as compris un peu ce que je veux dire? Tu pourras traduire ça?
Yes, I understand. Yes, yes. Ben maybe understood.
The mining industries?
Yeah, mining industries. So you cannot, I mean, if you talk about railways, il faut parler de mining industries. Tu comprends un peu?
Yes. I mean, there are mines in British Columbia. The southern part of the province develops them later. Interestingly, though, they are far south of the Canadian Pacific Railway. It builds branches to go down there, but it never promotes tourism to that region. That's a purely industrial railway lines. Whereas this east-west line across the province doesn't actually traverse any mining regions, in a sense. It's a strangely unproductive line that was only there to move things from the Pacific Ocean to the prairies and to Eastern Canada. Okay. It's a supremely unproductive railway in British Columbia on the main line, whereas there are feeder lines later that come in there. Whoop. So to just highlight, and I'll be happy to share this slideshow if you like, Etienne. I flagged a few differences that I mentioned at the beginning about what's different about automobile tourism. Automobile tourism develops in Western Canada substantially later than most other places in North America. But it has some of the same characteristics. So instead of having a top-down management, like with railways, you have no management effectively. The governments build roads, but they don't, aside from a traffic code, right? They don't really control how private tourists use their automobiles on them. The gas station doesn't control how people use the vehicles that, rely on them for a fuel source. There isn't really a central authority in this system, and I'll put a question mark after system. There's a system to railways. Maybe automobile tourism doesn't quite have a system in the same way. It's diffuse, it's dispersed. There's no command authority here. The most common sort of automobile is it belongs to a family, right? It is the private property of a family, which has its own desires, its own schedules, its own destinations that they like to visit. You have this profound flexibility compared to railway tourism. And I think that one F word, flexibility, ties in with another, that sense of freedom. That tourism is increasingly being wrapped up with a sense of personal autonomy and a personal control over one's own mobility and what one sees. And parenthetically, when I mentioned the importance of family for owning the car, I think that with automobile tourism and maybe railways too, the linkage of tourist travel with visiting family hasn't really been studied enough by historians. I think a lot of the time when we are acting as tourists, we're in fact on our way across the country or across the province to visit family somewhere. So visiting family and maintaining these social linkages becomes almost an excuse for a lot of tourist activity, right? So I put this up. This is from a small town newspaper near Vancouver, about 100 kilometers east of Vancouver, where the mountains begin. And it's a nice quote here. The key part is in the middle. This is in 1935. The tourist industry is only beginning to sort of, auto tourism industry is only really getting its, getting underway by this moment. And this small town newspaper has this great quote about the experience of auto tourism. And it says midway through here, it says, "One does not travel long or far by motor until he is able to sense the friendly town, restaurant, store, or garage from its appearance. The town that is untidy, unpainted, and run down at the heels appearance has no stop sign on the tourist. The tourist will stop at the smart towns he comes to, rather than take a chance on the next town being uninviting and inhospitable." There's this imperative under auto tourism for businesses and for communities and for entire regions to make themselves appealing and interesting to tourists, to make it visible, an inviting appearance, a welcoming appearance, a tidy appearance that, yes, lots of places have food, gas, and lodging. That's, supplying it isn't the difficult thing. It's to be an appealing community to visit. Why should I stop at this town to stay overnight when I could drive to the next town? And what makes them, the way to succeed in this new competitive landscape is to develop attractions and assets that will draw tourists to pause at your community or quite literally at your business. Something eye-catching, something to differentiate yourself from other businesses, from other communities. This didn't exist with railways. The railway brought you there, it delivered you at the same time, it brought you to the station. Tourists tend to stay at the railway's own hotel. With automobiles, you have this radical new landscape of competition. And it shapes how communities look, how communities think of themselves. So there's this imperative to stand out, to differentiate oneself in this new landscape of competition. And there's only so much that towns and hotels and business owners can do. They can't rebuild the road themselves. So this is a great slide from Quebec. It's out. They can pressure governments to build better roads, to put up better signs, for example. Small towns don't have the budgets or the power to rebuild roads themselves, but they can apply pressure because bad roads is a disincentive for tourists to travel there. So this is one thing. There's this interesting thing where places are trying to make themselves seem different to stand out, and yet they're trying to make themselves seem the same. Everybody wants a high quality road. Everybody wants to stand out and seem different. So you have two directions at once, right? To differentiate, and yet it's such a common phenomenon that it's very leveling too. And the leveling is sort of a pun, like you want to have good, level, smooth roads. You don't want to have roads full of mud. You don't want to have confusing signage. You don't want to have a road that seems unsafe. Some regions, the roads get reputations as being dangerous, of being roads that you'll get stuck in, roads where you'll damage your car. Some roads get to be known as like deadly killer roads. That they have lots of accidents, and there's a high risk, well, there's perceived to be a high risk of injury or even fatality when driving some roads. Everyone wants their region to have a good reputation for good roads and not to have a negative one. Let's see, where's my next slide? Oh, this is this again. So a lot of the sources that I use, I use a lot of government sources in my research. I also try to really.
I'm leaving.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm leaving.
It's okay.
I got an exhibition to open right now, so
Okay.
I'm leaving.
All right. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye. Bye.
From Dakar. Thanks
Okay.
from Dakar. And I hope we will see together here in Dakar, because we'll prepare that to receive everyone here in Dakar. Thank you.
All right.
Thanks.
Thanks for
Merci.
coming.
Bye.
We'll prepare. I'm talking with HN. We'll prepare to receive you guys, everybody. I'm talking to everybody to receive you in Dakar.
Great. Thank you, Amy.
It will be a pleasure.
Thanks.
It will be a pleasure to receive you guys. We are going to prepare that.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Thank you. See you.
Thank you. Thank you again. Thank you.
So government sources, private family sources from family-run businesses, and this sort of source here, the ephemera of the roadside. Tourist brochures, travel guides, postcards. I have boxes and boxes full of postcards. How are communities representing themselves? How do businesses promote themselves? This is the making of an image, right? The shaping of tourist images. But I'm also really interested in, I'll skip over this maybe. I'm also really interested in concrete changes to communities. So prior to the 1920s, it was very rare in Western Canada for communities to develop a historical image of themselves. They tended to boast about their resource wealth, about the good agricultural land, the availability of hunting, of cheap land. They didn't tend to promote a historical image, except you can see here, I've got 3 pictures. Totem poles in Western Canada were widely promoted. So that's using Indigenous culture that is seen as being ancient, as a way to promote and differentiate oneself along the Pacific coast. There were cenotaphs, and it's, we're talking the day after November 11th, right? After World War I, many communities developed cenotaphs to honor people who had fought in the war, the Great War. And occasionally you would have a moment where for some anniversary or a centenary, for example, you might build a replica of, say, an old fur trade fort. But these were unusual events, and they were usually ephemeral. But starting in the 1920s, as British Columbia becomes more opened up by new highways, it's only in 1926 that Vancouver gains a road connection to the rest of the province, beyond the mountains. There's a proliferation of historical monuments and memorials and markers. So local communities and small businesses begin to latch onto history as a kind of tourist asset, a new asset. And I'm just going to show you a few examples of this because I know I'm running a bit late here. You have this proliferation of roadside businesses. Municipal auto camps, which are where a village or town builds a small free campground for auto tourists to spend time at. And those are usually free, in fact. They're seen as a way to draw people there to spend money and time. Most of the businesses are family run, and they are relatively undercapitalized. This is not a way to get rich quick. It's a way to be your own boss, but it's a highly seasonal business. In British Columbia, when people from Vancouver and from other regions begin driving into the province, you have this tradition of mountain landscapes, mountains, forests, rivers, and canyons. And I think that for many tourists, this evokes a sense of adventure, right? They associate themselves with the fur traders of 100 years earlier, with the gold rush of 50 years earlier. And this landscape, this exaggeratedly vertical landscape, has real elements of danger to it. Driving the pictures here are the main highway through British Columbia in the 1920s and the 1930s. This is the arterial highway of the entire province, and I think it inspires a sense of adventure. Many of the businesses that set up along this road are in the same locations where gold rush roadhouses had been, where fur trade posts had been in the 19th century. So that has a sort of a very concrete link with yesteryear. And there are some still existing extant relics of gold rush days. So the gold rush in BC was in the 1850s and the 1860s. This is when, for the first time, very large numbers of Europeans or whites come to the province and begin to stay in large numbers. This is ancient history in British Columbia, right? The 1850s, 1860s. Oh, Etienne, sorry, turn your microphone on. Your microphone is off, Etienne, if you're... Etienne, you have to turn your microphone on. I'm not sure we can hear you, Etienne.
Je sais pas qui vous parlez, monsieur, mais pour le coup, on vous entend absolument pas.
Is he speaking to us? Maybe we can send him a chat. Maybe I'll just keep going because I'm not sure if he hears me. Maybe someone can send Etienne a chat saying that he's on mute. All right, I'm just gonna continue here, Etienne, because I'm not sure if you can hear me. You're on mute, Etienne, if you were speaking to me or to us. You have this great proliferation. Can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, good. Okay, thank you.
Yes.
You have a proliferation of communities using historical monuments and markers to make themselves stand out. everyone in British Columbia has mountains, everyone has forests. That's not a sufficient way to make one's business or community seem different anymore. People begin to use history, which hasn't been thought about in this province very much at all at this point, as a feature to differentiate themselves. So what I trace in my book is the proliferation of these kinds of monuments and markers along highways. You have First Nations or Indigenous people participating in this new visual economy as well. So these are these people have been compelled to live on small Indian reserves, but they are participating as much as they can in this new roadside economy. They're selling distinctive cultural products, baskets, especially basketry is really popular, clothing, ceremonial type artifacts that they're reproducing for sale to tourists. They are putting up, I'll actually skip over this, but I try to argue that they established some of their own monuments to claim to prioritize Indigenous history. Hey, don't leave us out of this. You know, we have been here thousands of years. This is our land and our resources. Don't try to cut us out of this new visual economy of the roadside. And then you have the first museums begin appearing. So this might sound, you know, in the British Columbia interior, outside of Vancouver, this is the first museum. It's in the back of a gas station. And you can see it here at the very top left. That's the interior. This is a privately run museum owned by people who have a gas station and a campground. And they have set this up as a way to make their gas station the one that you patronize when you drive through Clinton. Governments are not taking an active role in this. It is largely up to small businesses and small local boards of trade. And I've got a few other examples here of where people latched onto the stagecoaches of the 19th century. You have, by the 1930s, a few more communities are trying to set up museums. And this museum in Kamloops, BC, which is sort of right in the middle of the province, they've taken an old fur trade building and they've picked it up on a truck and moved it to the center of the regional park, where there is a municipal auto camp. They're actually bringing the historical artifact to the place where auto tourists stay in town, rather than trying to steer them to a sort of a more obscure neighborhood of the district. These kinds of outdoor museums, these monuments and markers spread all around the province. They are always linked to the highway. You don't find monuments or markers or memorials more than they're always in sight of the road, the main roads. So in effect, you know, history becomes completely welded onto these routes along which tourists travel. And, you know, the apex, the main goal for tourists in this time period was the former capital of the gold rush, a ghost town called Barkerville, which had a population of only 50 in the 1920s. And they were mostly quite elderly Chinese men who had been miners there and decided to stay. And people in the region saw this ghost town as it's underdeveloped, it's falling apart, it has an aging population, and yet people say this is very different. This will draw people from California. This will draw people up from, you know, the United States to see this sort of frontier gold rush town still in a relatively intact state. And they start promoting it. They start putting up markers. They're very concerned about not letting it fall apart. There are some efforts to promote the place in the 1930s when there's a new gold rush. In fact, there's so much change during the 1930s new gold rush that people are concerned that its atmosphere of decay that makes it so appealing, its romance, will be dissipated by modern gas stations and electrical streetlights. And some people see it as a historical asset that's being devalued. And there's concerns expressed by a few promoters. I realize I'm going over time. I'm going to try and wrap this up really quickly, Etienne. It's only in the 1950s, so more than a decade after World War II, that governments get involved in this in a big way. Highways are being modernized. There are massive new bridges. Highways are being paved and expanded. British Columbia is having a massive resource boom with a big influx of people, more than 1 million people by 1951. And some of these historical assets that were set up in the interwar years are bypassed. They're not as easy to see from new modernized highways. Sometimes they have to be knocked down and moved as they widen a highway. There's a lot of concern. I'll skip over that. There are more museums. They begin to proliferate. And then the provincial government gets involved in a big way in 1958 with a huge centennial celebration where they provide funds to preserve old buildings. The province funds I'll call it the restoration of Barkerville. It is turned into a historical provincial park, and the government erases certain modern buildings and modern utilities in order to preserve it the way it had looked in the 19th century gold rush. And you still have this commercial imperative. There's more and more of these businesses establishing fake forts or simulated forts or pulling any wagon they can beside the road to make themselves stand apart and make it their brand. But the province is now developing this second theme for its tourist economy. There's still mountains, there's still forests, there's still the image of wilderness, and yet you now have this popular complement in the form of historically themed tourism. And it's all organized around highways, and it's concretely, designed for auto tourists. Railway tourists don't have access to this effectively. They are still stuck with the one track of wilderness tourism, of sublime scenery in the Rockies. Auto tourists have access to that, but they also have this interesting second track that's just developed in a 35-year period, a whole new theme for promoting BC and Western Canada generally. And with that, I think I'll leave it at that so that there's lots of time for questions. I hope I haven't gone too over time, Etienne.
No, it's fine.
All right, I will cut off there. I'll leave you with this image, and I'm happy to share these slides later on. And I'm just going to go on. I can answer questions now, or I can go on mute and catch the next presentation and take questions afterward. What would you prefer?
I was thinking that you can have some question from everyone because the student has to leave at 3:45.
Absolutely.
So that's fine. So do we have some questions? Est-ce qu'on a des questions? Étudiant ou pas étudiant, chercheur ou pas chercheur? Peut-être, maybe, yes, thanks. Merci Audrey. Maybe you can explain or develop the concept of system of automobility for the students in a way of developing tourism. I guess that will be interesting for them to hear that what is important for it's not only the car, but it's all the system as you develop that's very important for tourism.
Have you read John Urie's work on the system of automobility in the class, perchance?
No, we didn't.
It's the railways. It's very clear to see as a system. Shivelbush and other scholars, the rails and the locomotive are one machine. It has a top-down management, and it can be very difficult to think of the automobile or automobility as a system because, again, no one authority is in charge. The state builds the roads, families own the automobiles, gas companies, oil companies, don't have a lot of sway over either of them. Yes, Etienne, it's a great article that's worth reading. So what's the characteristic of this system is that it's sort of scattered, it's diffuse. It's not top down. So there's a whole series of factors that can shape it, right? If gasoline prices go through the roof, that can really shape, negatively affect the number of tourists out on the road, right? Or if there's a global pandemic and no one wants to get in an airplane or on a train to travel anywhere, that's a major incentive for people to
vidéo.
the road. Sorry, I missed your question.
I don't
Okay.
think that was a question.
I mean, I'm not sure if it's happening in Lyon right now, but car sales are through the roof in North America. Tent and camping gear sales are through the roof. Campgrounds are full all summer. In British Columbia, for a few months, they said, we are not going to accept reservations from people from outside British Columbia. We're going to save our provincial park spaces for people from this province as a way for them to get outside. So, it's really unpredictable, I guess, how this system can be shaped by circumstance. Fuel prices, bad weather, that can really affect the seasonal takings for the tourist industry. So it's not top down, because it's disorganized in a sense. I think it's a lot more unpredictable than with railway tourism. So for operators in the tourism industry, there's a lot of things that are outside of their control. They just have to respond to changes that are happening. And so I imagine, I don't want to guess what's happening there in Lyon, but I'm for big hotels, for luxury hotels, this is a terrible time. Whereas for people who run in campgrounds or small motels, I think it's been a relatively good last 6 months, a reversal of normal circumstances. So I think that it's just far less predictable than railway or cruise ship tourism. That's my main takeaway, right? It's unpredictable, and I don't want to say chaotic, but for people working in the automobile-oriented tourism industry, they are captive to circumstance, and there's often not that much they can do to change things. They sort of go with the flow. They have to go with the flow. They can lobby governments for assistance to help coordinate a tourism campaign, but they can't get out there and pave the highway themselves, or they can't affect gas prices themselves. It's interesting because I think there's far more people employed in automobile tourism related sectors, and yet they have less influence politically than, say, a big railway hotel or a major railway company, because they are disorganized, and they're competing against each other too most of the time. I'm not sure if that's something you've discussed in the course, or if I'm off. I don't want to be like steering you in the wrong direction, but
No, that's fine.
I think that people are often just sort of captive to circumstance here.
Yeah. Question?
I have a question.
Yeah, no,
I have
go
a
ahead.
question. So since there are like a lot of concerns regarding environment lately in the last years and so on, and since auto tourism is, well, obviously affecting the environment and the changes and so on, do you think there will be like some changes in order, like regarding all this, I don't know, some protests or whatever, and that people, like the things will just have to change in Canadian tourism in order to continue, like to develop and to grow and to just stay kind of in touch with all of this?
Oh, as a historian, I'm really reluctant to guess about the future. I'm reluctant to speculate about current events as a historian. In Western Canada, where I know best, if you are a railway tourist, the only way to be a tourist by railway is to basically expect to just sit in the train and look out the window. The train network in Canada is so primitive and so underdeveloped today. It's been going backwards since the 1950s. It just goes backwards every year. That can never really replace the automobile. I would suggest that without auto tourism, in Western Canada, you would practically have no tourist industry anymore. You would have Vancouver, you'd have Whistler, right, where people go to ski. And you would maybe revert to the conditions of the 1890s, 1910s, early 1920s of tourism being something only for the very rich. Resort hotels, luxury railway travel, people flying in, right, to Whistler to go skiing or go to a wedding, or there's a wine growing region in BC called the Okanagan Valley.
Yeah.
You'd have people flying in there as they do today. But I think that without auto tourism in Western Canada, tourism becomes an extremely elite practice again.
What about like with the buses? Because you have like this really scenic route from Vancouver to Whistler, you have like sea to sky gondola and waterfalls and so on. Is there like an option to actually, I don't know, go on the bus and just like the whole bus stops in these like places and you just look at them like all together instead of each person with a car?
It's you know, I don't know. So I know Greyhound service has been terminated in Western Canada. Effectively, there's no longer a bus transport system, except there are tourist buses, as you described. So people who would come as a group. That's how I went and saw the region about, Carcassonne. When I was there a few years ago in France, my partner and I, we went to Carcassonne and we took a bus tour around the region to see the castles. It was great. But, you know, you have to be willing to travel along on other people's timetables. Are people willing to give up the sense of freedom that they associate with touring, right? You see things, you enjoy, you learn something perhaps. And yet if driving is so much a part, the experience of freedom and being like in charge of your own timetable and route, if that's so wrapped up with tourism, can you separate them? I think maybe in North America at this point you can't.
Okay.
Maybe in some key spots. So I would say in national parks, perhaps you could. There are so many people who want to go to Banff, Jasper and Glacier, or Yellowstone and Yosemite in the States, that I think you could convince people to give up their cars at those spots, but they'd still have to drive there to get there in the first place.
Yeah. But like, are there any transportations, for example, I don't know, straight from Vancouver to Joffrey Lakes, just from there back? No?
Maybe like a guy with a van.
Okay.
But no, nothing major, nothing
Not
serious.
really like public transport or something.
Yeah, it's, you know, how much money could people make at it? Probably not enough, you know.
Okay. Well, because there are like really a lot of tourists, for example, in Joffrey Lakes, in these kind of destinations that are super popular. So I imagine there could be some profit, because usually people probably stay in Vancouver in a city, right?
Yes.
And then they go around.
And then they go around and they rent a car, right?
Yeah, exactly.
I'm teaching right now a course at UMBC called the Automobile in North America, a 4th year seminar. And I've been joking with my students. I'm like, we really need a Canadian history of like roof racks. You know, the racks where you can put a kayak or a canoe or a bicycle or a snowmobile or a power boat, right? That's so much of the way that North Americans are used to, especially Western North Americans, of getting in touch with nature is to drive to it and then take your muscle-powered vehicle off of the rack and then go and enjoy the quietude and the contemplation and the challenges of nature, and then return to the parking lot and drive home. You know, like that's always piggybacking on the automobile. Can you convince people to throw their kayak in a bus full of other kayaks to go somewhere? I think the whole point is to be by yourself, right? And it's the car that makes it possible.
Okay.
Is it similar in Leon? Like, is the automobile the way that people get in touch with nature and history so much as here? I was impressed by how many trains and buses there were when I visited France, that you can go from place to place and see things without, but we also rented a car a lot of the time, so I'm not sure.
Well, I think in Vancouver, in the city, there is like a really good transportation system. But if you want to go somewhere else, it's a complete disaster. I mean, you cannot really, unless you have a car, you can't go almost anywhere, right?
Yep. And you'll see Canadians are always talking, why don't we have fast trains the way that people do in Europe? And then you say, well, what towns would it stop at? There's Toronto, there's Montreal,
Yeah,
you know,
true. Yeah.
and what's in between? The biggest town in between the two places is a town of 100,000 people.
Mm.
And in the SNCF system, like, that doesn't even merit like a blink on the fast trains, right? It's got to be much bigger. The population just isn't there. So yeah, Canadians love talking about fast trains and why can't we be more like Europe with the train system? And it's like the numbers are never there.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and it's even worse in Western Canada. So it sort of just doesn't make sense. What's awful is that the automobile is what makes sense. So it just keeps going along the same path.
Mm-hmm.
And there isn't a way to give it a shake yet. It's, we're really, really stuck on this path.
Okay.
And yeah.
What about the history of Vancouver? Since it's like a really young town, right? I mean, city, sorry. Is there like anything else that they can kind of promote from its history apart from like indigenous population and totems in Stanley Park and so on?
Yeah. Things I've seen, it's still very much Stanley Park and totem poles.
Yeah.
And when people talk about developing the Indigenous tourist sector, they're often trying to build on past experiments that I hate to say have not worked usually.
Mm-hmm.
They are popular, they're promoted for a few years. The government encourages it. And then the government pulls its support after 5 or 6 years. And then often the businesses or cultural centers end up closing.
Okay.
I think that there was a big effort 10 years ago to build a big new modern high-tech private historical museum in the Gastown neighborhood of Vancouver. I'll write it down. It was called, if you want to look it up, I believe it was called the Museum.
But it would be in the center of Gastown, or because it's like it's quite, I mean, it's the only old part of the of Vancouver anyway, right? So it would kind of disturb the, I mean, everything. Would it be like a new building or just
It was in an old building.
Ah,
and so
okay.
it was kind of Disney-esque, right? Like there was a belief by these promoters that people would come and see. It was like laser shows and smoke and holograms, and it was like a Disney ride.
All right.
They phoned me up and they said, "Oh, we're looking for people to consult on this, right? Would you be interested to talk to us?" And I said, "This is going to be really poor if it works for the things that are established. So no, I won't." And after, I think it lasted 2 years.
Okay.
They sunk many millions of dollars into this, and people just didn't want to go.
Mm-hmm.
I think Vancouverites were like, no, we already know the local museums.
Yeah.
Grade schools, right, which often send kids to museums for field trips. They said, well, we already have established relationships.
Mm-hmm.
And tourists, I thought, said, well, they were trying to appeal to the cruise ship crowd.
Okay.
And I think tourists said, I would rather be outside and walk to Stanley Park.
Yeah.
I am not interested in learning about the history of Chinese settlement here or about.
Well, especially because there is already the UBC museum, right? And it covers all of the history.
Yep. They took a gamble on something that could have worked but didn't, and it flopped in a big way. I think the thing that Vancouver is branding itself on now would be art, like modern art galleries and things.
Okay.
I think that people are not. I'm not saying it's the right thing or a good thing as a historian. I think people still want to see big trees, totem poles. People step off the cruise ship and they think they're seeing the Rocky Mountains, right? That's the popular stereotype in Vancouver. But I think it's remains still pretty limited, that history is still a secondary part of the tourist image of Western Canada.
Yeah.
Nature is always tops. History is a second, or I don't want to say a distant second, but it's always in a sort of a backup role or complementary rather than the primary one.
Okay.
Even for Western Canadians themselves.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
maybe Ben, you can also, I think, add to the Vancouver tourism the Granville market, because I saw last time I went there that there are a lot of fruit and vegetable available in Granville market, and also in nearby Stanley Park. By promoting agricultural food and local food coming outside of Vancouver, there has been a political view from the city to become green in 2020.
Yeah.
So it's part of that, I think, to emphasize on local food and close agriculture.
There's the local food, which of course appeals to local people too. I'm often surprised how Vancouver, Toronto, and Montreal, the three big cities in Canada, still haven't found a way to promote themselves, especially, well, maybe it's hard to promote yourselves to Americans for this, but to promote the sheer diversity of foods and the multicultural nature of these cities, right? Vancouver, the population is 25 or 30% of Chinese background, 20% of Punjabi background. There are so many cultures and communities in all three of these cities, right? That you could spend a lifetime sampling different kinds of restaurants and different kinds of neighborhoods that have dry goods stores and clothing. The people who live in these cities most feel pretty spoiled, right, for getting to meet people from different places and eat different foods, right? It sounds corny, but like it's a major asset. Can that be used to promote these cities to people from, well, I'm not sure if that's going to draw anyone across the Atlantic Ocean from Europe, because in Paris and Lyon you have the same thing to an extent, but can that draw American tourists, for example, come to visit these big cities in Canada because you can spend a week here and you can explore and learn something about a whole host of different cultures? And you can go to an art gallery and you can see Niagara Falls or whatever it might be else that you want to do. That's something that really distinguishes the big cities in Canada, especially from the United States. Now, is being distinguished a way to actually attract tourists? I don't want to be presumptuous. I don't know how Vancouver, Toronto, Montreal could promote that to American tourists. Come to Canada in order to see the world and dine at different restaurants.
Oh yeah. Well, this is Vancouver has its modus, which is the best place on earth, and also it's it's very not. But but you have also one thing, that is that Vancouver is the second city for TV series and movies, I guess. Which takes place in Vancouver because it's cheaper than in the United States. So it can promote Vancouver's area and surrounding, I guess.
Well, come and see Vancouver because we can pretend to be another place in movies.
Yes.
It's, I don't know. I think that's something that's going to draw some people, like fan people, fandom, people who are really interested in certain industries and stuff. So you mentioned that awful slogan. I hate that slogan. I mean, the traditional slogan in British Columbia since the 1950s was beautiful British Columbia, right? Nature, scenery, seemingly untouched by industry and settlement. It gets harder as more and more clear cuts appear along the main highways, and logging is sort of in your face. But I think that is still deeply ingrained. It can be really hard for places to change their tourist image. If you have to be consistent to make it work, but then you can get frozen into it as well. So sorry, I'll pull it up again. The book about Quebec I was just showing. I received this just a few weeks ago. Rural Quebec is still deeply frozen in this idea of being an image of French peasantry from the 17th century, right? And Montreal still has the image as being sort of slightly sleazy and naughty, and I would open it up, but it's always supposed to be like the Paris of North America, right? And that's a way to draw Americans who can't afford to go to France.
Yeah.
You've got the same book.
Yeah, sure.
So so the great attraction for Quebec is pretending to be like France to America. You can't afford to go across the ocean, but you can afford to drive up here and see something different. It's a weird. So not only is the image of these places as being frozen in the past, right? But that tourist image itself is frozen in the past now. It's hard to change it.
Well, but regarding Vancouver, I always had a feeling that it was like presenting itself as this modern city, like obviously surrounded by nature and so on, but it was also promoting like the food and so on. I don't know, it was like, it's clearly you have so many amazing restaurants around, and then in Yale town, it's like this specific part of town where you have like better restaurants, right, and galleries and so on. I don't know, I always had the feeling that it gave this, I don't know, kind of feeling of being modern and with like different food and nations and cultures and so on. Not really typically like indigenous Canada.
Yeah. Well, people are trying to do all these things at once to an extent, right? We could say that they're trying to diversify the image to appeal to niche audiences, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
You could also say that they're just getting sort of confused. If the one big brand has worked, beautiful British Columbia, if that worked for a long time, killer whales, orca whales, right? Trees, the idea that the Rocky Mountains are just there visible from Vancouver. Are people going off track if they're trying to come up with all these other ideas? Are they taking that one for granted? When people drive beyond Vancouver now, they're increasingly on big highways to Whistler or to Kelowna, and they're seeing more clear-cut logging as they make these drives, right? Visible on the valleys that they drive through. There's logging trucks and logging roads and forests knocked down. Maybe you need to start diversifying because that's being damaged or eroded. That traditional image of being beautiful and pristine in a wilderness. When you fly across the province now, if you don't see clear cut and logging activity beneath you, you're probably over a national park. That's the giveaway, right? And most everywhere else, it's just a patchwork of logging because of clear cut logging and accelerated logging in the last few decades. So I think maybe that's a sign that people are recognizing that wasn't working anymore, or it wasn't drawing to people to Vancouver. I'm not sure. You could see it as a good thing to diversify, but you could also see it as evidence that the traditional ones aren't working anymore.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm chattering too much. I should be inviting more questions.
Are there any questions from people, maybe?
Can I ask a question?
Sure, ask away.
So when I was there 3 years ago, we went from Lyon eastwards into like Haute-Savoie. I'm probably saying it wrong. Savoie?
Savoie, yes.
Haute-Savoie. We went to Haute-Savoie. We went to like Jura. We didn't go as far as the Alps, right? We turned and went north towards like Geneva and stuff. Does Lyon associate itself traditionally in tourism with those mountain regions to the east? Is Lyon like the gateway to the mountains to the east? Does it claim this region as sort of its tourist hinterland, or is it completely cultural and like cut off from those regions? We drove a long time, right? But I'm wondering, who does that territory belong to in terms of?
It's more like Grenoble, which is surrounded by mountain and Alps. Lyon try to get this attention to the Alps and the mountain and the snow, but it's not close enough from the Alps. And I think Lyon does its marketing on culture and the crossroad between the south and the north of France, rather than the closest to the Alps.
Okay. Because we knew we wanted to go visit that region, and we said, well, we're going to go to Lyon first and enjoy that. And it didn't seem like a huge drive, right? The highways are so fast, and there were train options too. But I've been curious ever since, like, so Grenoble is the center of, it's the tourist powerhouse of the region.
But you got at least 40 students, so maybe they can answer if they are from Grenoble or prefer Lyon. But my guess is that Lyon is much more famous for food, gastronomy, culture, museums. Yes, than the Alps. But Grenoble is one of the major cities, and the students love to study there because they can go skiing during holidays, rather than in Lyon. It's a little bit further from the Alps, I think. But we had some promotion of the Alps when the municipality brought in the past some snow from the Alps in a place in the center of Lyon for a couple of days before it was reduced to water. Now it's not something that they do, but in the past they promote snowing and going to the Alps. Yeah. Do we have any question? So maybe just to sum up, Ben, you can maybe say a few words about the system and the role of actors, because you talked about indigenous, you talk about association a little bit, and shoppers, and I don't know, owner of a restaurant, etc. So there are a lot of people orbiting around the auto tourism.
Yeah.
And you search for a book. Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
You know, the period that I look at is before it's really organized. The industry, there is an industry, right? It is the emergent industry. New regions that had no tourism effectively whatsoever are opened up by car culture, and they're starting from scratch, right? They're starting from zero almost. There are hotels, right? But those are for business travelers, right? They're there for families. They're there for mining prospectors, right? It's very much sort of each business for themselves. In communities, a board of trade or a chamber of commerce might sort of make an effort to promote auto tourism, but they don't even have the power to coordinate. So it's really when you see provincial governments step in and take an active role that the industry coalesces as such, right? That it becomes clearly an industry with representatives and a provincial tourist a board like a trade board for tourist industries. I think it's in the 1970s that you have a Ministry of Tourism developed in the provincial government. So it's in this region, right? It comes quite late. Tourism is really disorganized prior to that point. It's growing, but it doesn't have a voice that's united to advocate for its interests. So I think that comes a lot later in this region than in most other parts of North America, because the road network is so poor. Until then, you just have a couple of railway companies which have a lot of power and influence. So I guess what I could say is that the regions I'm studying are usually they're not at the front, you know, they're usually actually quite a bit behind other places in terms of developing a tourist sector. and that's linked to the road network, right? So often historians are looking at what happened first. Let's look at who did this first, who was on the cutting edge, who was an advanced and an innovative district or region. And that's valuable, but as a historian, I'm like, well, that's only a few places. Most places are playing catch up or are sort of behind the curve. And I think that those are worth looking at too, right? Just don't always fixate on the new and the most innovative, because that's just a handful of spots. Look at what's happening elsewhere as well. I guess that would be my main point. Like, it's most tourist history in North America, especially, is going to be about places not being innovative. It's mostly about places responding to patterns that are already in place elsewhere, trying to play catch up, trying to develop some sort of asset or amenity or identity out of what they have, right? They're working with what they have locally. They don't have a lot of money, so they're trying to scrape something together to make it work. And I think that's probably what characterizes the industry overall, right? Is that it's not innovative. It's usually just trying to get by. It's often the sign of an underdeveloped economy. If people are really latching onto tourism in a big way, it's usually a sign that other economic activities are not working. I'm not sure if you talked about that much in the course, right? If a region's deindustrializing, right? If your mines are closing, if your steel plant is closing, that's often the moment when people say, well, we can go to tourism, right? We need to develop this. We need to get people into the hotels and spending money in our downtown. Healthier economies usually don't need to worry about tourism all that much. It's your sort of hinterland regions, your cities like in Portugal, Porto, right, needs to spend more attention on tourism than Lisbon does, because Porto's had all the closures of factories and things. It's often a sign of a region that needs a hand or is relatively underdeveloped rather than out at the forefront. I'm not sure if that's helpful.
Sure. But that makes me think of the development of vineyard and wine culture in the south of BC. Like you told me to go there, and it's very growing in this area of tourism with wine, which is really new for the region, I guess.
Because the fruit orchards are losing money, and that fruit economy, the orchard economy, was sort of collapsing and crumbling, and so people came in and saw cheap land and developed wine, and that's been the complete switch to tourism there, right? People don't try to talk about the history of the region. They don't promote the environment. In that region, the federal government wants to establish a new national park, and many of the people are fighting against it. They want to keep ranching, they want to keep mining, they want to keep logging, and they don't see a national park as helping them that way. There's all these weird contradictions and things, right? And it hasn't entirely become a tourist economy yet. It's still this tension between resources and tourist promoters. What are you doing?
Okay. Do we have another question? Anna, maybe?
Yes, I have another question.
Sure.
So considering that, well, there is no real public transport around Vancouver, as we said, is there, like, besides Vancouver itself, besides the city, is there like any problems with mass tourism in, like, I don't know, Kanagan Valley, Vancouver Island, anywhere around it besides downtown?
Yeah, we do.
Problems with I think the problem in British Columbia and around Vancouver is that much of the provincial economy is sort of seeing the southwest corner, we call it the coast, right? Vancouver and Victoria are becoming sort of socially and economically divorced from the rest of the province. So people, there's been so much immigration from around the world and around the rest of Canada to Vancouver in the last 30 years, that a lot of people in Vancouver don't have links to the rest of the province, don't have family links. They haven't worked in other parts of the province. So you see a lot of growth in the southwest corner, and you see tourism interests are getting more concentrated there, and in Kelowna, where the wine is, and in Whistler, where people they go skiing and they go to a wedding to get drunk at someone's wedding there, right? And there's British Columbians, Vancouverites, are really not that interested in much of the province otherwise. So it's getting concentrated in just a few spots. Joffrey Lakes, which you mentioned, right? It's popular on Instagram, and suddenly everyone wants to go there. And there'll be a new Joffrey Lakes in 2 years. It'll be some other spot where an Instagram influencer goes, or a movie is filmed, right? And people want to go see where the scene from the movie was shot. What was that movie, Avatar, that came out a few years ago with the blue things? I haven't seen it, right? That was shot on Vancouver Island near a community called Tofino, and everyone wants to go see the forest where Avatar was shot, right?
But like Tofino is popular anyway, right? For surfing and things. Is
Yeah.
it like one of the most popular places on the Vancouver Island?
Marijuana and surfing, right?
Ah, okay, yeah.
But now it's got the movie link too. And so it's getting concentrated in just a few spots. And I think it's because Vancouverites just go to a limited number of places, because so much of the tourism is internal, right? And then internationally, the tourism is still Banff and Vancouver, and really less and less in between. If you drive through the province in a 10, you may have noticed it. What were once major highways, the Trans-Canada Highway, almost all the motels and gas stations are closed down, or they're falling apart, right? Because people don't even want to drive anymore. They want to take a fast highway to Whistler or Kelowna to get drunk at a wedding or go skiing. Otherwise, they're like, well, I'll fly to Indonesia or Thailand or Europe, right? And I don't want to bother going to see my own province. If I'm going to visit my family on the prairies in Manitoba or Saskatchewan, why would I take the time to drive? I'll fly. It's cheap. I'll be done in an hour, and I won't go and see any places in between. So I think there's this really interesting sort of this separation economically and socially of the province's regions is resulting in this intense concentration of tourism in Joffrey Lakes, in the Okanagan, and at Whistler, while other regions are seeing their tourist economy crumble. Which, I mean, I hate to say this because I want to see those businesses do well, right? As someone who enjoys going around the province and exploring the back roads to see what's happening, the roads are less crowded. That's fine with me, right? But I want to see those little museums surviving. I want to see motels have lots of people at them. I think it's really a problem of underdevelopment in the industry and concentration at the same time. So I think it's part of the same thing happening.
But now, after the quarantine, are there any changes? Like, are people discovering the BC more than before, or not really, since they can't really, I don't know, fly to Indonesia?
I think, yeah, absolutely. So I think that the camping sales and the car sales are evidence of that. People are out and trying to learn more. So actually, that sounds awful, but this pandemic might be great for the province's tourist economy, because who are your best customers for tourists? It's people who live in the region already. I think we tend to really valorize or elevate international tourism or cross-border tourism. But the best tourists for Jura and Haute-Savoie is always going to be people from Lyon, from nearby, from next door, right? They're always there. They're not going anywhere else. So you want to develop those links more, I think. Within the region. So maybe this will actually be a shot in the arm in the long term. And if airlines are having so much trouble right now, and if airlines are going to be slow to bounce back, if airlines are going to have higher prices in the coming years because of the need to make some money after this this awful year,
Mhm.
that might be good for local regional tourism too, right?
Yeah.
Even if the gas prices go up, it's still better to rent a car or drive somewhere than to fly, because the prices are that much higher, especially for families, right? Whereas you're packing, kids into a plane as well. So, I mean, nothing against the airline industry, but like I personally wouldn't mind seeing that. I would like to see people know their regions more, their provinces, their states
Mhm.
more. I've really enjoyed coming to France a couple of years ago. I went to Poland last summer, not this summer, but the summer before, and it was fun. But I'm kicking myself saying I should be also exploring parts of Western Canada that I haven't seen as well. We can set that aside, I guess, for now.
Okay. Does anyone has more question? I think the student has to leave at in 5 minutes, I guess. So we can stop here if that's okay. Ben, you have.
Is there a break time and then come back, or?
Usually we don't have a break during but we can take 5 to have a break if you want to. Yeah, sure.
Oh no, I was hoping there's another presentation, right?
Sure. There is another presentation. Yeah.
I'm gonna be here. I want to catch that. I'll go on mute and stuff, but I would like to hear it, so I'll be
Yeah,
here
sure.
as well.